Still very much an active painter. And I do this. I'm an admissions officer and I love it. Yeah, Eli, do you want to introduce yourself just a little bit? And then we'll get
Yeah,
into like the deeper introduction
sorry,
afterward.
the lighting's starting to get weird. We had it all set up and then the sun started going down over here. Hi, I'm Eli. I'm a junior in the painting department at RISD. And I do some other work with quilting and textiles projects, but we're just going to be focusing on painting stuff today because that's what I would consider my main practice. But yeah, I don't know what else I should add. Oh, I'm from Salt Lake City, Utah. That's where I am right now. But yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so maybe let's just go ahead and get started. Awesome. Thanks for the nice replies. We had a couple of people that are thanking us already. Don't thank us just yet. We still have to, we're about to start right now. So yeah, I guess we can go ahead and get started. So you all just heard Eli's introduction. Eli, and you are currently a junior with us at RISD, yeah?
Well, for like 4 more days.
Yeah, right. And then you you're done for the semester, and then you transition into I guess you have your summer, and then you transition to like senior year. So
Yeah,
how are you
I've got
feeling about things?
well, I'm doing the Maharam Fellowship this summer, so I'll be working on some mural projects with a nonprofit in Utah for that. Miraculously, we were able to pull through and make it happen, just because it's outdoors and everything. So yeah, it's going to be happening with precautions, and there are certain things that had to be modified. But yeah, so I have that starting up as the semester is ending. And then yeah, we'll see what happens in the fall.
Okay. Okay, cool. So and you know, of course it's on everyone's mind. Like, how are you dealing with like COVID?
Yeah.
how's quarantine slash shelter going for you? Like, how does that affected like your studio practice or like even classes? What's classes like for you right
Yeah.
now?
I mean, I'm lucky that as a painting major, I'm still able to work in my preferred medium for the most part. But I have been trying to take advantage of some differences. Right now, I've started a quarantine quilt project where I send instructions and pattern pieces in the mail to friends from around the country, since people have scattered back to their hometowns. And then people send me back their quilt piece contributions, and then I'm sewing them together at home. But yeah, so that's been a new project that I don't think I would have done otherwise. But yeah, I think in general, I've been staying pretty busy. I know for a lot of people, the natural healthy thing to do is to kind of slow down, but I guess I'm going in the other direction for some reason.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
what? Yeah, I feel the same way about that. You know, I see a lot of like posts or like people being like, no, it's okay to like back off and like you know just relax from some of these things right now, but my natural maybe because I'm a workaholic, but like my natural inclination is like boom, I need to like go to the next thing, I need the next thing, I need the next thing. And I think like most of y'all like or y'all didn't hear this conversation earlier, but me and Eli were talking earlier and it was like, oh yeah, I'm doing my studio practice, oh yeah, I'm also trying to bake all these different things to try, oh yeah, I'm also like XYZ, right? So I feel you on that.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, that's what works for me. But yeah, I definitely admire people who are just kind of embracing this different pace. I'm trying to lean into that as the semester ends.
I know, I know. I will admit, like, I struggle with that so hard. Like the like relaxing thing, or like self-care and like relaxing thing. I'm like such a workaholic person. Anyway, so let's okay, so we're here today to talk about you and your studio practice and all that. So let's take it all the way back. Like, what's your thing? What's your story? Like, what's your interest in like art? What were you making in high school?
In high school, I was actually doing a lot of ceramics. I did a lot of pottery and wheel throwing, but I was also doing painting through all of that. So my portfolio when I applied to RISD was like a combo of those two things. But yeah, and then I've kind of leaned more into painting because I feel like that gives me the room to work more conceptually with larger like narratives that kind of spread through more than one work at a time. So it feels like that story gets put together as I make more work. And then when I get to see it all hanging in the same room, I'm like, oh, that's what it's about. Like it's kind of like a slow process to figure out how the works are connected, but it seems like each new edition makes it a little bit more clear.
Yeah. So say that one more. I might have missed that right in the beginning, but you said you started out not necessarily doing painting, right? Like
I was doing some paintings, but also a lot of ceramics.
ceramics. Okay.
Yeah, so like functional, like mugs and bowls,
Yeah.
like very traditional pottery.
Right. So then when you like applied into RISD and got in, of course, did you have an idea what you were like going to go into, or were you kind of just like, I'm here to just experience the first year, I'll figure it out once I get to like the end of the year when I have to declare your major?
I think I was kind of between ceramics and painting.
Mm.
And I feel like if I had known more about the different departments back then, I would have also been thinking about printmaking.
Sure.
But yeah, I think that I ended up leaning towards painting pretty heavily because my drawing classes kind of helped me realize that I liked using, like a medium where I could work figuratively and where I could kind of express ideas in a way that felt almost illustrative, but not necessarily. And the pottery seemed more like maybe the meditative like craft hobby that I needed as like a side gig to have a way to relax. Like that's kind of how I think about the quilting work that I do on the side is like it's kind of like a less conceptual project for me where I get to just work with my hands and appreciate that tradition.
I love that because I feel like that touches on two different like ideas or like itch is the wrong word, but like necessity to make in different modes or different conceptual like ways of thinking or like pleasure in a different way. Like oftentimes when we talk about like a studio practice, it's often like laced with this like creative fun outlet that is so like a myth, right? Like we know it's a lot of work. And so like it's super interesting to hear you talk about like, oh yeah, like I'm basically then as like, back then I had like two practices or now even two practices where like I have my practice where there's like research heavy conceptual thought, like art history. I know art history is in there. We've talked about it a little bit, or like, it's labor. It's a lot of work. And then you have the practice where it's more about just, it's to like relax from the other practice.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Okay, so since we're in the RISD conversation, I'm going to give you sharing capabilities and maybe you can guide us through some of like your first year experience and what that looks like. And there you go.
All right, this might take a second.
Okay, so we have there. So why don't you just before we jump into like all some of the works, like what was your first year like? Like what was, what did you think? What were you expecting before you got to RISD, and then when you got to RISD, what was it actually like when you got to RISD?
Well, I think I was one of those high school kids who kind of thought that I already knew how being an artist worked and like that I kind of felt like I think I was maybe a little bit self-centered about it, and it took me a minute during my foundation year to kind of realize how much I had to learn and like how much I was going to be exploring mediums that I wasn't necessarily used to. Like I kind of thought that I was ready to go into either painting or ceramics, but I spent a lot of foundation year focusing on my spatial dynamics class and drawing as well. But yeah, I think that for me, it was a process of realizing that not only do you have to have like the work ethic and the motivation to make your own work, because I think that I was in a place where I had that, but that I had to learn how to talk about my work and I had to learn how to talk about other people's work and think more about how what I'm making fits into a larger historical narrative as opposed to just being like this isolated body of work that I was making by myself. So I think that it opened me up to like understanding the larger context that I was making work in a way that I don't think I would have understood otherwise.
Right.
But yeah, should I start clicking through some?
Yeah, let's see some work.
All right, so we'll just start off with the really early stuff. So yeah, this is kind of what was happening in my drawing classes. So yeah, just a lot of like learning the basics of different types of perspective and learning what happens with changing the lighting and how you can manipulate that to your benefit. And yeah, just getting messy for sure.
Can
And then this is,
can you go back real quick?
Mhm.
Can you talk about the drawing on the left? I'm really curious about that. And I know that a lot of that has to do with like perspective and like observation and things like that. But like the you know the parts that are like outlined versus like what are like not, I guess, or like seem very, what is that in like Conte crayon?
yeah. No, that's a good thing to point out. So yeah, that was for a perspective assignment, and I guess like a lot of what I learned at that point was that like art making is really physical, because that was like a larger drawing, and it was all done by hand without a ruler. So I had to like learn how to like physically control my body in a way that I could do that, and that definitely still applies when I'm making larger paintings right now.
Wait,
But yeah, so
how large are we talking?
well, I don't think it's like
like
big, because I mean, RISD foundations, you work pretty large sometimes, but it's like at least 20 inches wide and maybe 30 tall.
okay,
Uh,
yeah.
but yeah, so the red was kind of the color that I started with just because it's lighter. And then I worked with the black is like covering all of the architectural space, and then going in with red again to show some of the organic material because that was drawn in the RISD Nature Lab. So kind of starting to find a distinction between those two things.
Right.
But yeah, so the red lines are like triangulating where the ends of different surfaces are and what the corners of the stairs are. So it's like a measurement process that that we were getting the hang of.
Interesting. And I see like a lot of figurative work or like fairly representational work here. I mean, was your high school portfolio also like that, or did you like enter into RISD and then like, oh, you suddenly then started exploring more figurative stuff?
I think it's always mostly what I was interested in, although in high school I think I did a lot of landscape work just because that's kind of what's popular here in Utah, and it kind of like being at RISD kind of gave me the opportunity to think more about like what do I actually want to make as opposed to like what is popular to an audience, because when you're in art school you aren't really thinking about an audience other than your peers.
Gotcha. Yeah.
All right.
Sorry, I totally hijacked that for a second. I know you were
No,
about to.
no, it's totally good. This is some examples of some spatial dynamics projects. So on the left, we have a sound skirt that I made. So all of the little blue pieces are laser cut wood paneling, and then they're sewn on to the skirt that I made, so that when you walk, it makes, I mean, I guess it's kind of like a rain stick noise, but yeah, basically like the movement of the person wearing it determines the sounds that are made. So that was for a project that was supposed to be creating a project in response to some sort of outdoor experience. So I was thinking about walking back home in the mountains during the fall when there's like a lot of sound from the leaves that are drying up. But yeah, and then the project on the right is a paper sculpture project done based off of a seed pod from the Nature Lab. So it's just cut paper and fishing wire to hang the pieces. But I don't know, I think sometimes the simplest materials, especially for experimental work, are the best way to go, just because you don't have to worry so much about like the result, and you can really just experiment without feeling the pressure of having to make something valuable. So yeah, that's what was happening in that class.
And this was in spatial dynamics, right?
Yeah, and I unfortunately don't have any examples from my design class as much, but design can really be a pretty broad class depending on what professor you end up having.
Right.
And then this is,
There's a quick
oh
question
yeah,
asking about the paper piece specifically, if they were a white and grays from shadow, or were they colored? Or is that like a color paper?
the pieces are all, I'm trying to remember what kind of paper that's called. It starts with like it's like a fancy, like slightly translucent paper, but it's all white paper, and the lighting is kind of creating that effect, but because the paper is slightly transparent, that kind of has an interesting effect on the way that the shadows form. But yeah, just kind of letting the other design elements do the work as opposed to going over the top with trying to figure out how to incorporate another element like color as well.
Right, right. I mean, it seems like that would be like such an interesting like exploration in like light and form itself. Yeah,
Yeah, and I think that that's a lot what that class is kind of about, is figuring out not just what your object that you're making looks like, but how it interacts with like the space around it.
absolutely. And thus spatial dynamics.
Yeah, we were going into it.
Yeah,
I have no idea what that was about.
that's so funny. Okay, let's see the.
Yeah, so these are from the painting a day assignment that happens during the beginning of sophomore year in the painting department. So we were required to do landscape work at first, doing a lot of traditional plein air painting, and then so that's what's happening on the right. It's just based on a building over at Brown University, and then on the left is a self-portrait. But yeah, just learning how to mix and apply paint quickly is a lot what that is about, but also starting to figure out how you can kind of create unique content with the formal choices you're making with color and paint application, so that your work is starting to have its own voice differently from your peers, considering that you're all kind of working within the same constraints for that beginning few projects. But yeah, it's a lot about kind of figuring out how to abbreviate your usual pattern of making so that you can do it more quickly and you can do it on a smaller scale. Because these are all like 12 by 14 inch panels, or maybe 9 by 12. They're small.
Okay.
And then yeah, so this is all still sophomore year. I was kind of starting to think about, like, I knew that I was interested in figurative work, but a big challenge for me was figuring out how to care about the space that those figures are spending time in. And I feel like during this part of my learning experience, I kind of avoided dealing with that problem or confronting that issue of the context of the figures by just doing these party scenes where the architecture wasn't really the part that created space. It was just like this buildup of more and more figures, and that was kind of creating the environment that the main characters or the main figures would be inhabiting.
Right.
But yeah, and then this is more of that, but this was kind of working from different source material. I do a lot of work from screenshots of like TV shows and documentaries and stuff like that. So that previous work was kind of a combination of a lot of different sources. This one is based off of some Pina Bausch choreography. She was a modern dance choreographer. So I took a couple different screenshots of different moments throughout this couple, like maybe like a 3-minute span, and then kind of consolidated them into one image.
Interesting. Okay. That's
But
interesting.
yeah,
That's interesting. You said dance here and like where you're pulling your sources from. Like, but when I look at the two, I'm like, oh, my quick read is like, oh, these remind me of like religious scenes. And like, I'm sure that was part of the intention too. But like, the first person that comes to mind is like El Greco for whatever reason. I think just because of how you're like layering your figures in this, more so the other one, but in a very specific way. But yeah, super interesting. Okay,
But yeah, no, then that's definitely a good point because I think that I look to Renaissance painters and Baroque painters a lot for reference because of the way that they stack the figures and the way that they use bodies to create architectural space almost.
Yeah.
But yeah, as somebody who isn't religious in any sense, I feel like it's always interesting to get that feedback because I think that culturally it just doesn't occur to me as much. And then when I put the work out into the world, I get to kind of see what associations other people are making based on their own experiences.
Fantastic.
And then yeah, so this was kind of the beginning of the party paintings. I guess it's maybe a little out of order because it comes before these other two we just looked at. But yeah, so the initial assignment was to do a painting of these two nude models. So that's the man in blue with the bald head, and then the woman in the orange dress with the orange hair. And then we were tasked with giving those two figures a context to be in. And again, like my lack of comfort with a specific context and architecture kind of led me to just fill the space with bodies and create like this party scene where instead of making those figures the focus of whatever scene is happening in this specific space, I could instead kind of camouflage them behind like other social interactions. So that was kind of the beginning of that I guess, trend in my work. And more recently, I've been trying to challenge that.
Yeah. Can you, we had a quick question that came in. Do you feel like you could try new art mediums at RISD, even if you more commonly work with one specific medium? And I think more specifically thinking in terms of like EFS,
Yeah.
experimental foundation studies, for those that don't know yet.
Yeah, I mean, I never would have made an apparel piece that with the goal of like creating a sound, like that SoundScript project was so different for me. But yeah, so I think that you don't necessarily have to have experience in a lot of mediums. You just have
Right.
to be comfortable with opening up to those possibilities. Like I was really uncomfortable with woodworking going into foundation year. But the fact that I was kind of forced into learning that process was really beneficial, even though I'm in the painting department now where you wouldn't think that it would apply. But because I'm like comfortable building my own canvas stretchers, like it actually ends up being super convenient to have those skills in a way that I wouldn't have necessarily predicted.
Right. Right. Okay, so I
I
think
don't
we
know,
just
does
had that kind of, yeah, I think so. We kind of got a different question here, which I think is a perfect transition for you. How did you get to figure out putting figures in an architectural setting eventually, which might be a good transition into your
Ooh,
year.
yeah, wow, foreshadowing.
I know,
So
right?
that's a quick glance at what I was doing freshman and sophomore year, but we'll move into kind of what I'm working on currently. Um, so this is all work from junior year, and basically, as far as like figuring out the space that I wanted my figures to be occupying, um, there was a lot of thoughts that I had about like domestic spaces and the home kind of as a setting, but then I kind of moved more towards like transportation and cars specifically because it feels like, you know, it's a personal space in the same way that a house is, but it can happen in any place. Like a car kind of has a more liminal effect on the painting as far as like choosing a setting.
Mm,
So I felt like that was a really good place to start. And that also fit in really well with over this past summer, I was doing a lot of just drawings and sketches of roadkill based on memory. Like I would, you know, bike past it, and then when I would get home, I would draw it out. So that kind of combined into a project where I was thinking not just about like how do I create an interior space, but then what happens outside of that space as well.
yeah.
So that there's kind of that push and pull of the inside outside composition.
That
But
is,
yeah, so this,
oh,
oh,
go ahead.
sorry, yeah.
Oh, I was
Oh,
gonna
just
say, we just keep cutting each other off. Um, so I was gonna say that's super interesting. A few things that I want to bring up that seems so curious to me is that like you talk about the interior art and exterior similar to how like Bonnard talks about interiors and art and exteriors, like, or like there's a different interest between like Bonnard and Matisse and how they treat interior exteriors. And it's interesting to hear you talk about that, and it's such a like 21st century thing to be like, oh yeah, like in cars, and then expanding like beyond just a home, but like the private space of a car. And like the moment you said that, it immediately made me think of like all the times I've caught other people in their cars screaming or like blasting to music or like picking their nose or whatever. And it's, you're absolutely right. Like we treat like our vehicle like a very extremely private place, but it's also like very much exposing. Like it's so vulnerable at the same time. Anyway,
Yeah, yeah.
I'm going down a rant. Sorry.
No, yeah, I think that that's a really good observation. And of course, even when I hear those associations with artists, I already know, like now I already want to go back and look at some more Bonnard paintings and like think about that again. But yeah, so this project was the image on the left is what the painting originally looked like after like a 2-week assignment where like by this point in the painting department, like it's really just about making personal work. So this was just all personally prompted imagery. But yeah, after the feedback that I got and how my critique went, you know, they kind of actually leaned into me. Like it wasn't necessarily pleasant, but I got like a lot of really helpful advice. And then by the end of the semester, the image on the right is what the painting looked like as a finished product. So I thought a lot more about color, and I thought a lot more about the specifics of the individuals in the painting and how I could give them more personality. But yeah, and then also of course like just some formal tweaks. But yeah, there was kind of like a moment where everybody was really connecting well with the hand of the passenger in the back seat was working really well. And so I was trying to figure out how I could pull that moment and draw it out into the rest of the composition. So like that area right in the center of the painting kind of didn't change at all.
Yeah.
And I kind of like adjusted everything around that.
Can you just brought up a really big point about critique culture. Can you talk a little bit about that, like for a second? Like,
Yeah. Yeah, I think that I was really intimidated going into RISD, thinking about critique because my high school art classes had been doing critique, and I kind of thought that it would be the same. But I found that critique at RISD was like a lot more of a positive experience, and it was very constructive. And I think that it took me a minute to realize that it really wasn't about comparing yourself to others. So like when I say, you know, that it was like kind of a rough critique, that doesn't mean that it was bad in any sense. It just meant that I was getting like a lot of feedback on things that weren't working. And that's kind of what you want. You know, you don't really want a critique where people are just patting you on the back and saying good job, just because that's not necessarily going to help you think critically about your own work. But yeah, you get into a headspace where it doesn't necessarily feel personal or negative. It just feels like kind of more problems that you get to solve because that's kind of the fun of it. But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
no, I think so. I think as an admissions officer, I hear a lot of questions where like students are like, I hear critique is terrible or like scary, and like they're terrified of it, and or like we make, and I know I would love to hear your thoughts on this, but like a lot of what we make is so personal to us, and we're delicate, right? Like I'll admit, my heart's like I have a delicate little heart, and so like when I make something, I put a lot of like effort, time, emotion, and all this stuff into it. But to participate in critique requires like a certain self-awareness to like, and removedness from the object itself in order to better yourself. Yeah, and I think
Yeah,
that like I'll admit too, like my background wasn't in fine art. Like I really had a good critique when I came to RISD and like as a grad student, and that's like a grad level critique is like no joke, right? Like, and I learned the hard way in some sense, but yeah, it's a really interesting thing.
Yeah, and I think it's as soon as you can frame it for yourself in the context of you're getting feedback on how you can more successfully convey your ideas through your work, then it starts to feel really positive.
Yeah.
So instead of thinking like, oh, this piece didn't really connect right, I was thinking, I have all of this feedback from people who want to understand this painting, but they don't, and so how can I give them the tools to do that?
Right, because
Um,
at the end of the day, it's about communication.
yeah.
Like
So yeah.
I think about this anecdote where someone is like, they're making this painting and they're like, oh, it's a really sad painting and like all my angst and everything is in this, but it's like a bright yellow painting. And critique helps you reconsider that to consider like, well, if you want to communicate XYZ, what do you need to do that?
Yeah, definitely. Um, so moving forward a little bit, so that painting we just looked at started at the beginning of first semester, and then this one was kind of at the end. So I guess I had come to a place where I was realizing that I was starting with such bright colors that I didn't really have anywhere to go with that. Like I was starting on full volume, and so that I couldn't turn it up at any point. And so this painting was about the same size. They're both like maybe like 30 by 40-ish. Well, that doesn't seem right because they're a little more square, but you get the idea. But yeah, basically I was thinking about like how can I use earth tones and more neutral colors to kind of have a better sense of control. And then once I get to a more developed place in the painting, I can turn up the volume and like tweak certain areas. So like the phone screen was a place where I used more saturated colors so that it would actually feel like it had that glowing light effect. Um, and I was thinking a lot about like I really like that's kind of I guess one of my guilty pleasures is like on phone screens or on t-shirts in paintings I like to throw in like specific references. So it's like what album are they listening to? Like what kind of phone background would this person have? Like thinking about those types of things.
Okay, interesting. And I see the
And
similar motif. The similar motif that keeps popping up is the roadkill, the deer.
yeah, and I haven't really, it's not that I'm super attached to that specific symbol. It's more that I think I haven't really found another symbol that works well in the same way yet. So I've kind of been trying to figure out what maybe the next step for that is so that it's not formulaic.
Right.
But yeah, right now I'm still kind of stuck on the roadkill thing a little bit.
Oh,
And
someone
then
asked what album are they listening to?
oh, it's a Leonard Cohen album. Oh, it has like a long name. It's like New Rituals for Old Traditions or New Traditions for Old Rituals. It's something like that. I feel like such a poser for not knowing it off the top of my head. But yeah, Leonard Cohen.
That actually, you know, what's really interesting about that question is that it makes me think of like Angela Dufresne. I
Mm,
was talking to Angela Dufresne. For those that don't know, she's a faculty member at RISD, and I was once talking to her about her paintings, and she's like, "Oh yeah, these are narrative paintings. Like that person is saying this to this person," and she like sat in front of me and one of her paintings and just went down this whole list explaining to me like what the conversation was happening in individuals, but to have that like full narrative in her head, I thought was super interesting. Like that changes the context for me now, knowing that like, oh, they're rocking out to this person. Like that changes the mood of everything.
yeah, and I mean, regardless of whether or not that information always gets to the viewer, because I of course don't always have the privilege of getting to tell people, that kind of thing. I think that like building up that lore regardless is really important. So like in this work, I was thinking about like, well, where are these two figures going after, like this painting is happening in one moment, but what's the moment before that and what's the moment after that, and how can I like hint
Mm,
to those aspects of the storyline. So I guess that's something that I'm thinking about a lot right now is how do you paint one specific moment, but do it in a way where the viewer is going to be thinking about it as a longer timeline,
mm.
um, which is hard. It's hard.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, these are again back to the car, which this was actually the point where I realized that I was really excited that I had gotten to a place where I had figured out kind of the context that I wanted these scenes to be happening in. But then as I was making these paintings, I realized like I felt like the car symbolizes so many things, especially in American culture, and it feels like a very individualistic symbol. It also feels like I'm not a car guy, like I don't like cars, so I kind of got into this place where I was looking at, you know, this vehicle that I feel like also symbolizes luxury and class, and I was like, that's not really, you know, what I'm going for. So these were kind of, I got to these paintings and then I kind of felt like they were a turning point into like pushing that in a different direction maybe. But yeah, thinking again about expanding the scene and moving past kind of just the one specific intimate moment.
Right. And it's so crazy even to just look at this and think about your sophomore year painting. Like, what a shift. Like, I'm just like how you're dealing with space is so different. Um, yeah, and like the like gestures and like the answers you're choosing in order to demonstrate on the page is like so much more nuanced and like more complex or like a little less straightforward. And then thinking about like how you were just like stacking figures before as like as a way to like deal with the surface as opposed to now where you're like dealing with it head on.
Yeah, and I think that's a good observation because also I feel like and like last year I was really worried that I had to kind of fit everything into one image. Like I had to tell the whole story in one picture. And I feel like now I'm at a place where I've realized that that's an impossible task. Like
Right.
no artist can do that. And so I feel like instead I've gotten to a point where I've realized like I have to be more, I have to edit more when I think about what I want to put into a scene. And that having more and more gestures and more characters doesn't necessarily mean that I'm saying more. So paring it down to scenes like this that feel a lot more desolate was kind of a way to do that.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, so then these were, I mean, these were thinking about how I could expand that previous scene more as well. So they're supposed to be in like an arcade or a bowling alley, like parking lot, in those two scenes. And so this was kind of thinking about like, how do I talk about like the moment either before or after that, but in a less literal way. So I was really excited about using bowling alley carpet because I feel like that's such a specific reference that like culturally a lot of people know what that means without me having to like illustrate a scene where these figures are actually like performing that action.
Yeah.
um, but yeah, and then also again just thinking about lighting and color. I'm always thinking about lighting.
Oh
It's
no. Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard.
Oh my gosh, yeah, don't even get me started. What's interesting about this is like I look at the other ones and I think about like it like the space, right? Like you enter the painting like horizontally in depth into like a narrative scene where like it builds upon each other. And then flip to here and it's suddenly like an abstract as it like flip-flops between like an abstract and representational painting. The way it's structured and format and like such a curious shift. Can you talk a little bit about like that like transition between that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that for me, these two paintings were kind of the realization that even though I really love the history of portraiture and I'm really interested in painting figures, that they're not a necessity, and that sometimes I think I let them get in the way. Like in high school, my paintings were all very like technically focused, and it was all about traditional figure painting and portraiture. And I feel like that training kind of prevents me from moving past that. Like, I don't really want my paintings to be seen in the historical context of portrait painting. And so, for me to kind of move away from that, I have to then sometimes make paintings that aren't portraits.
Yeah.
But yeah, so these feel like partially a way to do that. And then, like you said, talking about abstraction, as somebody who like I like looking at abstract paintings, but I never really partake in that that
I can
content.
feel
I
that
feel like
feeling.
yeah, this is kind of a way for me to like start to have that kind of conversation without it having to actually be abstract.
Right.
Like it still feels like these could exist in a real space, even if
Mhm.
they're warped in certain ways. So yeah, then I've been taking silkscreen classes more recently as well. So I never really predicted that that would be something that I would be interested in. But yeah, screen printing has really been a way to simplify, especially with colors, since you're kind of required to just by the nature of the medium. But a lot of the feedback that I've gotten recently is that the colors in the silk screens are actually working better than the colors in the paintings. And I think that's because I'm forced to edit in a certain way.
Yeah.
So yeah, I've been more recently thinking about how I can maybe take some of the formal choices I'm making in these prints that are all, the size of like a piece of copy paper, and then like expand those into paintings. So that's something that I'm interested in.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that also, yeah, printmaking in this way, because I'm less experienced with it, I have to kind of start simple and start small. It's like, every time you learn a new medium, you have to go back to the beginning. And so I was thinking about like, how can I have these really small, simple compositions with only one or two figures and use that to say as much as I would say in a larger painting that might have like double the amount of elements going on in the foreground and the background.
Right. It's kind of like what you talked about earlier, just paring down to the most important point, like kind of just very directly telling us.
Yeah, and I think that that's, it's good to have those moments where you kind of get put in your place by a certain medium because, then you realize that maybe you don't need all the, like you don't always need the most complicated answer to the question. Like sometimes it is the simple
Yeah.
response that works best.
Yeah.
So yeah, these are like some of the most recent paintings that I've been doing. So this happened once I got back to Utah after leaving RISD last month or the month before. My perception of time is a little off right now. Um, but yeah, so this is, again, thinking about the car, but also thinking about that not necessarily as just a passive element of the painting, but as something that should have the same, like it should have motive and it should have character in the same way that the figures do. And then, yeah, creating a space that the car exists in. Like step one was like creating a space that the figure is in, but then it's like once you have that vehicle, then it's like, well, what's the next space that
Right.
you're putting the next thing in?
Right. Right.
And then this is again another more recent painting. I guess this one is a good one to talk about like source material again, because like here I'm using it. This is based off of photographs that I took of a car while I was on one of my walks, and then of my brother posing for me. But then this is all based on like screenshots from bad TV shows, and if you watch those too, you maybe even recognize like what my sources are, though I won't say. But yeah, so thinking about I guess like how guilty pleasures can be a benefit to your work. Like not everything has to be highbrow or complex or based in art history. So like I'm really interested in like bad TV like soap operas, and so this was kind of thinking about like those scene transitions where they like fade one image out and they bring another image in, and how I could use that to show like two different moments in time but also like a really obvious storyline kind of.
Yeah. I also love that you brought up like highbrow, lowbrow, and like sourcing not just from art history, because I think a lot of times when people think about art history, they automatically stop at like, I don't know, like
Rembrandt.
yeah, like that, or like if you're like read a little bit more, then you stop at like ab x, like 1960s, but like time still went on. You know what I mean? And so like
Yeah.
there's been a lot of work that kind of addresses that is very, lack of a better word, like lowbrow, but really brilliant and smart. That it's an interesting thing how I haven't even fully thought about it, but like it's interesting how we like tend to stop at a certain point in time as like that was history. And
Yeah, yeah.
now that's what I can touch. I can't touch like, so essentially what I'm saying is like I'm loving that like you're not like, I can see both, right? Like it's how they function. They like touch on that, but then they also acknowledge this other like period of time.
Yeah,
Um,
and yeah, I
I know
think it's
we're
important
coming.
to have
I know we're
those.
coming. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, you go, you go, you go.
I was gonna say I know we're coming fairly close. I know we still have 15 minutes more, but I know we still have a lot of work to look at. Do you mind if we quickly browse through like your process or like what that looks like? We do have
Yeah,
a few questions that came through asking that.
yeah, let's get to the nitty gritty. So this is a picture of my current studio space in my parents' basement. Um, so I have like a couple easels set up, like one small one and then one larger one. And it's like source imagery is really important for me since I'm only working like from observation of different like screenshots and photos I take myself. Um, and so you can see like my computer nestled in the background there, but then also like printouts taped along the bottom of the easel. Just because like I think that there's kind of this natural progression, like thinking back to high school where I was probably painting from like literally like Google Images to now where it's like there's usually maybe like between 2 and 6 separate images that I'm trying to combine into one painting.
Right.
So then it becomes really important to stay organized in that way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Yeah, so then like thinking about reference material like outside of just what I'm directly painting from, I really think about dance a lot. So there's like a book cover from these two contemporary dance collaborators who did a lot of choreography together. There's a painting by Andrew Alba, who's a Utah-based artist who I really respect. Some quilting work by Clara Wainwright, a Gauguin painting, even though I might dislike him. There's like all sorts of stuff that I try to keep around to remind myself the different places that I want to be referencing from. Yeah, let's look at this. So basically, like I was just talking about kind of source material and working a lot from different combinations of photographs and screenshots. But more recently, I've kind of been critical of that and realizing how dependent I am on photography in a certain way. So on the top right, you can see my Sculpey clay sculpting skills. Working very roughly, don't make fun of me, on this little cardboard and Sculpey model that I then photographed after lighting it a certain way. And that combined with like, I think I'm using 3 other like photographs that I took put together to make this painting. And then we'll go back to that. But so you can see I've got like my sketchbook out. I've got some of the photographs that I'm working from. And then this is like the current state of this painting that I'll be glazing over with lots of other colors later. We'll do one more of these real quick. So again, using a clay model, although I ended up actually swapping the order of those figures, so it's not even the actual photo I used, I guess. But yeah, so I think this is kind of like the way that I build up a painting, is working initially with really thin acrylics, and then once I kind of have my surface covered more, moving into oil paints. But yeah, just constantly reworking things and kind of trying to stay with neutral colors for longer if I can. And then working in the brighter colors later on. I think a couple of years ago I would have like started with the bright blue on the bus seats, but I've tried to move towards a more patient approach because I think it creates more nuance in the color combinations.
Absolutely.
We'll look at this one real quick and then we'll move on to some other stuff. But so yeah, this one is, just another process image of a piece that I'm working on. I've been having trouble with like, I think that creating specific characters and specific actions that are happening is something that I struggle with sometimes. So this was kind of an attempt to do a better job at that. And I think that it's always easier with autobiographical work because like I know me and I know the other figures who would end up in that work. So it's easier to see them as like fully rounded characters in a painting. But yeah, like thinking about like this action of bleaching hair is like a really specific event that happens if you do it like with your roommate in your own kitchen, and how that's maybe different from like the vagueness of a person sitting in a car without any other specifics.
Right, right.
So I guess should we talk about some of the artists that I think about, or do we have
Yeah,
time? Or
let's take a quick look at like who you're looking at, and then I have a few questions lined up. But if there's any questions out there that y'all might have, just start typing them in, and I'll skim through and try to pick a few that we can talk about with Eli.
yeah, we'll try, and I'll try to be quick about this because I want to answer questions too. But yeah, so this is a Danica Lundy painting, and when I found these paintings, I was just like, wow, she's already doing like what I want to do, and she got there first. But like in a good way, like that almost sounds like spiteful, but I'm actually really exciting. It's really exciting to see this work, because I feel like I have so much to learn from it. And there's something I think really complex about the way that she's fitting all of these different pieces of imagery into one painting. So I really admire that.
That's like
This is,
loaded. That single image is like
yeah,
4 different narratives happening, 5 different narratives happening at the same
yeah.
time.
Well, and all
Yeah,
of the objects have their own personality. Like it's not just the figures, it's like all of the other specific
right.
items that are giving you context for who these people are.
Yeah,
Um, and I
crazy.
think that, yeah, this is, a lot less busy, but I think it has that same level of specificity. This is an Aaron Gilbert painting, and that was wild when I realized that. So actually, first semester this year, he was my professor, and he came in and he introduced himself, and we were like, yeah, yeah, we know who you are, because he's like one of my favorite contemporary artists. So that was
That's so
like a really
wild.
wild moment. But yeah, just thinking about like human interaction and like the different ways that can happen. Like this feels just as personal to me as this painting, which is a Salman Tour painting. Even though like one of them is happening in like the privacy of somebody's apartment, and then the other one is happening like at a bank. And I think that that's something that I really want to be able to pull from. Um, but yeah, and then Salman Tour, like just the way that this guy is like creating lighting is like so intense to me.
And they're
Um,
such BB
really,
paintings. They're
huh?
so they're such BB paintings. They're so tiny.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and he's painting really thick too, which is why it's so amazing that he has that luminosity despite that. So that's something that I really am trying to steal.
Um, okay, so I think this is a perfect time to transition to some questions. I'm gonna take back uh
Yeah, am I off screen sharing? I tried
you're
to.
on screen sharing now. Um I'm actually gonna take it back for a second. Um so so y'all don't see a screen right now, right? Okay, cool. So one of the questions that we have was like, do you have a narrative starting out? Like what's like what like do you have a preset narrative already, like a full storyline, and then you just like pick scenes from there, or are you like building the narrative as you go? Can you talk a little bit about
Yeah,
that?
yeah, I'm not that organized. I instead of having necessarily like a really specific storyline, I'm thinking about like a more vaguely like a dynamic between two parties, or between more than that. But like the bus painting that I'm currently working on, like the idea was that there's this one group that's like observing like some tragedy or some like minor inconvenience, and then there's the group experiencing that, and then figuring out a way to illustrate that so that it has the potential to be a lot of different things. Like
Right.
the interaction between those figures, it almost looks like they maybe could know each other, but we don't know that. So I like I kind of have my own idea as I've been developing this painting, like, oh, this person has this personality, and this person's really into this like hobby, but I don't necessarily think that that's something that I need my viewers to agree with me on. I kind of like that someone else might think, oh, they're complete strangers and we're witnessing like this bizarre like awkward eye contact. So I like the idea that it could go either way.
Right, right. So you're building as you go along. You're not starting out first. And that's interesting. I love that you're acknowledging at some point that too, that like, we often talk about, at first we talked about communication and like clearly stating, but then now you're coming to a point where like you're letting some of that go as well. To be like, okay, well, like, does it need to be that tight? Um, I don't know. I think that's interesting. I don't know if you want to touch on that for a second too.
Yeah, I guess it's important to me that I kind of have like an overarching theme or an overarching relationship that I want to figure out a way to convey, but giving people the opportunity to come up with their own storyline for it, I think is fun. And I think that's part of why I like bad TV is that you really have to fill in the blanks by yourself. Like nobody's gonna do that for you because the writing might be bad.
Yeah. Oh my God. Absolutely. I love that you just like brought that up and immediately was like, oh shoot, I get it. Like this is super interesting and like actually perfect because it just transitioned to our next question. Heyo, I'm having trouble picking and sticking to a theme for my paintings. I love to paint, but I can't seem to get wildly passionate about one theme. How did you find out what purpose you wanted your work to serve as a whole and what you wanted to paint a lot?
That's a good question. I think you have to be open to the fact that you're going to be kind of scattered for a while. And even as an undergrad painter, I think it's early for me to be like, yep, this is my thing. So I'm like looking forward to like what my next chapter will be that's maybe not figurative or maybe not focused on these types of scenes. So I think like be patient with yourself with that because like the more open you are to exploring different types of content or different ways that you could paint that content, like the more possibilities there are for like what your thing is. But yeah, I mean, there's people who paint completely abstractly in undergrad and then they go on to become like, figure painters, or there's people who do textiles and then they end up being, like into expressionism. Like you really can't like predict that for yourself. So I think the more that you can, like, it's okay if maybe you do like really messy abstract stuff and then also like really toned down still lifes. Like for the stage we are as students, like that's a good place to be, I think.
Right. I think a lot of times too, like I think people think that like that's like you're making a brand, right? Like you have to like make your thing and that's your thing and you have to just stick to it. And in fact, like a really good example is like kind of what you're talking about, like Philip Guston, right? Like early on super duper abstract paintings and then suddenly takes this like shift into representation cartooning and like makes these like highly political um kind of satire paintings that are like filled with anxiety.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and
but
he's also a good example. He's also a good example of that lowbrow, highbrow thing we were talking about too. Totally.
yeah, oh, love Philip Guston. I have a
But
few of his
like he
quotes.
does this thing where he's like doing abstract stuff, and then he's like, I'm making paintings about like race relationships in America, and then he's like, shoo, like it really like it. Sometimes it's really complex and these broad topics, and then sometimes it's like, what's really important to me is like fingernails, like that's what I have to paint, like,
Yeah,
and being
or like
okay with
not
that.
being able to sleep at night. That's like one of the, like I think there's one where he's like smoking in bed and just like you sort of see like the nose and like the figure
Yeah.
with the like cigarette and yeah, that's a great point that you brought up. Like in fact, he has like full studies where it's just like a bunch of paintings where it's just like book, 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 shoes, like tin filled with paintbrushes and like just like the single object. And in fact, like it's not really well known, but he actually has a series of line drawings where it's literally just like the page and then like that's his work and he's trying to figure out how the line functions in relation to like the thing. So I think what me and you are both trying to say is that like you don't have to have like a thing. Like the point about what makes these people so interesting is the not having a thing almost. It's like the willingness to just keep like exploring and playing with different things. Um, let's answer one more question. I know we're right at 7, but if you have one more minute, let's try to do this one.
Let's go over a
Um,
little bit.
Yeah, yeah. If everyone's okay with it, I'm okay with it. So we have a comment here that's like IDK, I don't know if this is just today's culture. IDK as the preface. Um, but in my viewpoint, these feel like photos from a camera roll. So do you want to talk a little bit about like photography in this and like maybe our culture and like that a relationship to those paintings?
Yeah, I think that like once I realized how much like photography isn't in any way objective, it's just like another type of perspective, the same way that linear perspective and atmospheric perspective are both also just like one lens that like none of it's objective. And so then I think that I noticed how many contemporary artists are interested in acknowledging the way that camera lenses function and figuring out how to capture that in a painting. So it's definitely not the only thing I want to do because I think that that can be derivative, but like especially in like the hair dye painting that I'm working on, like
Right.
that's totally like a iPhone 6 selfie image, right? And like the way that it like warps your face, like my jaw looks like huge in that because it's like taken from like down here at that like bad angle, right? But like figuring out a way
The
to yeah, and yeah, that exactly. So instead of like ignoring that and trying to pretend that we don't live in a world with like iPhones everywhere, like
yeah.
I'm kind of trying to be like, yeah, that is like a big part of my day-to-day experience. So how can I like use that to my advantage? But also thinking about like, how does that hold me back that I view everything kind of like the way that I take a photo. So I do also want to be critical of that, and that's part of why I like the clay models as another, you know, um, another pillar to like figuring out how to build a whole composition.
Right. Because we do like the first thing that came to mind when I see some of the questions coming in is like do you draw from like life or photography and which is easier? And like oftentimes as an admissions officer and for like those interested in applying, we'll tell students like kind of steer clear from like drawing from photograph, but usually that's like because they're copying a one-to-one, right? Like the amount of like pictures I get of like Brad Pitt in the center of a page where they've just like copied that perfectly is hilarious. And but usually like it doesn't help. And when we talk about portfolios, like um what happens by copying, I think, and this comes back to your point, what happens when you copy a photograph is you lose a lot of information. You
Hmm.
lose understanding about light, you lose understanding about perspective, you lose understanding about like foreshortening or like how things are forming in different things. And that's why like from my understanding of what you're doing with building the clay models, those help inform like the structure of what this could be.
Yeah, so much, especially if you're working from like 3 or 4 different images at the same time. Like once you have to put those in the same space, like there's no human being that knows enough about architecture to like do that out of your head,
Right.
and have people believe it. So yeah, it's definitely complicated that way. But I used to draw almost exclusively from life, and my sketchbook would all just be like pictures of or like drawings that I had done of people I know because that was what was around. And then it kind of moved into, based off of photographs. And then I was like, this feels kind of boring that I'm just drawing photographs from my camera roll. And now I do a lot of drawings from my imagination, which I haven't really done since I was little because I feel like it got trained into me that I had to like look at something and observe it and make sure I was drawing it correctly. And so now I'm kind of in this phase where I'm like drawing things in a made up way where the anatomy is all wrong and I'm drawing with my non-dominant hand and seeing what happens when I do that. So,
Right.
you know,
I'm so curious to see once you start merging all three. Like,
we'll see what
um, I
happens.
know, right? Okay, so one final question, and then we'll release you from all of this. So yeah, I like the shimmy. Last advice or suggestions for everyone out there. Like, we're all stuck indoors right now. Any tips or suggestions about like studio practice or yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll give like one vague example and one specific example. So like vaguely, I think that everyone should just do something that they don't know how to do, like teach yourself to knit or like basket weave or something. Like
yes,
just work. And I mean, it doesn't have to be good. Like go make fairy houses if you're going on like daily walks or something. I know that's something a lot of people are doing anyways. Like figure out a creative option for you that's like not what you would normally make, so that you don't have to hold yourself to the same standard. And then I think for something specific, get a little tiny sketchbook, or something similar, a notebook, and do a self-portrait every day. And it can be like a 5-minute thing, it can be a 20-minute thing, it can be with a ballpoint pen from your bank. Like, just, I think that that type of practice, like even if it's for a short amount of time, is so helpful. And it's also a really great way to like check in with yourself, because you notice, like I did that for a couple months one time, and I would notice that like each day it looked different, partially because how I was drawing, but also because of like my mood and like my expression. And I think that it's a way to improve your art while also being like present with, I mean, like we've all got to think about our mental health right now. So for me, that's like a good way to do it.
Totally. Um, Eli, this was fantastic. Like, I am really excited about the work. I'm so excited to see what your last year is going to look like at RISD. And thank you so much for giving us this time and being so generous and like vulnerable in some sense. Like you really gave us a lot to like think about, and not just like technicalities, but just like conceptualities, or like thinking about art history, thinking about like our phone, thinking about like narratives, thinking about like, it was such a like rich experience. And yeah, thank
Well, I'm
you.
glad to hear it. Thank you for having me, and thanks for all the good questions, everyone. I feel like that really led us into some good territory.
Yeah. Before I let everyone, before I go, before I say goodbye or like sign off and everything, I just want to highlight a few more things for everyone else out there. We do have other RISD online events coming up the rest of the month. So some things that I definitely want y'all to think about is the National Portfolio Review Day, virtual portfolio day that's coming up on the 22nd for all our prospective students out there that are interested in applying. We also very much, this is super exciting. This is the first time for us. We're making a portfolio tips series for the summer. And we're starting out with a portfolio tips with Kara, making with unexpected materials. You know, this is a time where we're all stuck indoors. A lot of the stores are still closed. Like you can't get like fine art, like, you know, but this is a perfect opportunity to like think about things uniquely and creatively problem solve and things like that. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that. And then I'm doing a second studio visit with a student, double major, on the 29th with Taj Richardson, who's in architecture and printmaking. But yeah, thanks everyone for coming by. We are really happy that y'all are here. And again, one last big shout out to Eli because you're killing it. Okay, everyone, have a good rest of your weekend, okay? Bye.